All right, folks, welcome back to part two of the criminal justice policy online presentation. We're going to continue with the goals of criminal justice policies. So, criminal justice policies are implemented to change the way in which offenders are processed by the criminal justice system. So, when we review the recent history, it's going to demonstrate that many of the policies that have been passed are designed to be tougher on crime by increasing the penalties for various crimes and restricting the movement of offenders within the community. Now, despite the continued push toward punishments that show retribution, we are going to find some examples of policies that seek to change the definitions of criminal behavior and the responses by police agencies to crime. So, if you don't know what retribution means yet, that is okay. We will discuss retribution when we discuss the justifications of punishment when we start looking at corrections. But a punishment with retribution is essentially a punishment for the sake of vengeance. It's like an eye for an eye. So it doesn't have the same philosophy as rehabilitation, for example, or incapacitation, that you just want to put someone behind bars so they can't do that act again. The justice here for the victim and for society is to get back at that individual by having them behind bars. So this is what I was previously discussing, that many of the policies that have been passed with that review of the recent history have that retribution in mind. But we see society changing, or the perspective or perception of society changing. And in recent years, many states have attempted to either, for example, legalize the use of marijuana for medical purposes, or to decriminalize marijuana use in general. So this is kind of going away from that retribution mindset. So Malaco gives us a little bit of history about what's gone on in California and other states that have passed marijuana laws. And with the passing of marijuana laws, this will actually diminish the amount of people in jail or being prosecuted for marijuana crimes. All right, so this again is going away from the vision of retribution. So again, policies are passed because societies change, the problems that the societies have change, and their views change, their perceptions change. So something that was illegal before, they might want to make it legal now, or something that is illegal now, we might want it to be illegal later on. I don't want to get too political here, but for example, at the time I'm recording this, it seems that some police departments, or at least not some police departments, excuse me, some politicians are favoring a police reform that will not allow certain holds because of the current situation that's going on. So anyhow, let's continue. So some policies are going to be cost effective, or are often going to deal in part with cost saving measures, with saving money. So Malaco gives us some examples of the SAFE Act in California or Maryland, for example. But some of the ones I'll give you examples of are marijuana legalization, the death penalty, and community corrections as far as cost saving measures go. So for marijuana legalization, we've heard, arguments in favor of legalization and arguments against legalization. So some of those arguments for legalization are going to be relative to saving and making money. So if marijuana is allowed to be used for recreational use, for example, you're going to have less individuals of an adult age going to the correctional system because of a marijuana crime, at least for use. So that should diminish the population of your jails, for example. So that's less taxpayer money that's being used to house these individuals. Another thing is that now these states, for example, right, this is from Forbes, are making money off the sale of marijuana from taxes. Okay, we just look at Washington alone and California, $300 million, right? Washington with over $300 million. Then the issue of the death penalty, again, there's individuals who favor it, there's individuals who are against it. But one of the arguments against the death penalty is because of the cost-saving measures. Now, I don't want to give you an entire class here on the death penalty, but one would initially think that having someone locked up in prison for life without the possibility of parole is actually more expensive than the death penalty but implementing the death penalty is expensive because housing individuals in death row units and all the funding that's taken up during their appeal process and during their trial actually ends up being more than it would be for life without parole. Our department offers a class on this particular subject, which is very interesting at the graduate level. I'm not sure if it's at the undergrad level, but you should look into it if you're planning to do your master's here. Then community corrections, right? Community corrections is going to allow inmates to be housed within the community instead of being housed in a correctional facility. And again, some individuals might say, we don't want these individuals in the community because they can be dangerous, but other individuals are going to argue, well, we want nonviolent individuals in the community, one, for some particular reasons, but for the other particular reasons, it's going to be because, again, cost-saving measures. We don't have to feed that person. We don't have to keep them in a facility. We don't have to give them medical care. All we have to do is track them, and they come and see their community service officer, parole or probation officer, depending on what what type of sentence they have, and that way we don't have to house them. So again, these are just some ways or some angles for some of the issues or some of the topics here of how cost-saving measures can be implemented or could be argued for. I encourage you to read about the SAFE Act in California or what Maryland tried to do for technical parole violators. Now, when it comes to criminal justice policy or all type of policy, really, politics is always going to be involved. And specifically in America, we have two ways of thinking, really. At least we have two ways of thinking that are in the general sense, right? Two perspectives, and that's going to be the liberal and the conservative perspective. So I'm going to quote Mallico here. Okay, so according to Mallico, liberal politics are going to focus on the importance of due process, individual freedoms, and constitutional rights. Liberals will also look to the government to help create equality in society and to solve problems. Now, socially, liberals believe that the government should help support those individuals who may suffer from various disadvantages in society. So, in terms of crime-related issues, liberals believe that society should fight against the racist, gendered, and classist disparities that exist within the system. Now, when it comes to punishment of offenders, liberals tend to lean toward a more rehabilitative focus. Now, on the other hand, okay, according to Mallico, conservative politics are going to lean toward less intervention by the government and focus on more traditional values. Quoting the text here, conservatism also refers to a belief that existing economic and political inequalities are justified and that the existing order is about as close as it is practically attainable to an ideal order. Now, on crime specifically, conservatives see the actions of criminals as part of a rational choice process. Remember the theory chapter, the positive school versus the classical school. So they're looking at it in the sense that individuals are rational beings. They can make that calculated risk versus reward decision. So criminals are part of that rational choice process whereby offenders make a cognitive decision to participate in criminal activity. So conservatives will follow more of a law and order philosophy and generally cite values going back to retribution, which we spoke about earlier. So values that are in line with retribution, or like I also said earlier, values that are aligned for an eye of an eye into perspective on punishing offenders. So I don't want to get too political here. Okay, again, I'm quoting what Mallico is saying. I don't want to give you, for example, my opinion on this. Okay, so if you have a problem with anything I just said, or you feel that I may have misrepresented either the liberal or the conservative view, because I have had students in the past, and the way I like to say it is, look, I'm just telling you what the author is saying. That way I try to keep it as objective as possible. So going to the president now and criminal justice policies, right? Because now that we're discussing politics, so it doesn't really matter if the president is going to be a liberal or a conservative, right? and in all our lifetimes, they've always been a Democrat or Republican. Whatever their ideologies are, criminal justice issues are always going to be a hot topic for presidents, or especially during the election time. So a focus on policing first began in the 1930s, and on your screen you will see some of the history behind that. Then you're going to see what happened in the 70s with Richard Nixon, and how his administration declared a war on crime. And that's just some of the history. So because of the growing public concerns about crime, it seems that virtually every election discussion on criminal issues results in candidates presenting what's called a tough on crime approach or stance in their attempts to establish public support. Now, think about it. If any of you ever want to be a politician, or let's say just, picture yourself as running for office, you don't want to look like the politician that's soft on crime. This is why during election time, they are going to come out with a tough on crime approach. Now, you would think that as a leader of our nation's government, the president would have more say, but surprisingly, the president has essentially little power when it comes to making policy. Now, while each president enters the office with ideas for reforming policies, and again, policies that are not only related to criminal justice, it could be policies related to healthcare, education, social welfare, success. Success in making these reforms is dependent on the actions of Congress, of, again, the lawmakers. So it is up to the president to sign these laws and these acts that are proposed by Congress. Even then, Congress could still override what the president wants by a 2/3 vote. So presidents have no direct ability to pass legislation. Instead, their goal is going to be to persuade Congress to introduce items that are consistent with their interests. So this is why we have a State of the Union address. Those of you that are more familiar with politics, in January, the president usually comes out and speaks in front of Congress, and they will lay out what's called their legislative agenda. And within this legislative agenda, you will have oftentimes policies, sometimes more than not, related to criminal justice, and they will try to persuade Congress to make laws, propose laws related to what the president wants. This is why we usually want a president and a Congress of the same party, so they can work together, so that the president can convince them, hey, let's pass this, because if you propose it, I will sign it into law. So this is similar at the state level with the governors and members of state congresses, like in Tallahassee, for example. Now, presidents can also have significant influence in criminal justice policy in terms of who they appoint to their cabinet. This is why I have a picture here of Attorney General Barr. Okay. Also with their appointments into the judiciary, like into the Supreme Court or the appellate courts, excuse me. Before we had Attorney General Barr, we had Attorney General Jeff Sessions, which was appointed by Donald Trump. So the appointment of Jeff Sessions by Trump led to rolling back many of the Obama-era policies, as well as return to many of the tough on crime practices that were dominated, that were in place during the late 20th century. So during the Obama administration, they kind of went away from that tough on crime approach. And then now, with Donald Trump's appointments, particularly with Jeff Sessions, they went back to that. So that is a demonstration of how the president could indirectly influence how policy is executed, for example. Another example of how the president, and this is not necessarily it could influence criminal justice, but all other aspects, is how the president can appoint, for example, Supreme Court justices. So the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the U.S. Supreme Court would have, for example, another conservative justice in the court now, because he was appointed by the current president. Now, Congress. What does Congress have to do with criminal justice policy? Now, remember, Congress is the branch of government that's in charge with writing the laws, with writing the regulations, with essentially creating these policies. Okay, so just some quick stats here. Between 1946 and 1996, there was over 3,000 congressional hearings that were held on crime-related issues like drug abuse and drug trafficking, juvenile crime, white-collar crime, and court administration. Now, when comparing the data with the number of presidential speeches and conferences on crime-related issues, we're going to see that the president has little influence over the actions of Congress when it comes to crime policy. So actually, the research is going to demonstrate that the only variables that appear to influence crime policy discussions within Congress were the crime rate and whether it was an election year. Again, remember what I said, nobody wants to seem soft on crime. So more specifically, as the crime rate increased, the number of congressional hearings on crime-related issues increased as well. Also, the number of congressional hearings on crime um, dropped significantly during an election year. Okay, so again, presidential politics doesn't appear to impact congressional activity during the same year. It does appear to have an influence on actions of Congress in the following year. So this finding shows that it can take time to raise awareness of an issue within Congress and to affect behavioral changes. So here I gave an example of the current situation that's going on. Right now, for those of you that don't follow politics, if you remember from your government classes in high school, some of you that are poli sci majors will be very familiar with this. The lawmakers have what's called two chambers, the House and the Senate. The House is controlled by the Democratic Party, which um, would be the more liberal-minded individuals, and the Senate is controlled by the Republican Party, which would be the more conservative individuals. So, given the nature of everything that's going on right now, for example, with the death of George Floyd, these are the headlines at the time that I created this presentation. So we see here congressional Democrats unveil sweeping police reform bill that would ban chokeholds, no-knock warrants in drug cases, and at the same time, Republicans are are moving to make proposals as well. At one point in time or another, if they want to pass anything soon, they're going to have to work together and have the president sign it. Now, public perception plays a big role in policies. Um, remember that policies have changed over time, and that's because society changes over time, specifically perceptions. As research rolls out, or as people start realizing that some things may not be as taboo as others, public perceptions will change. For example, the previous marijuana um, laws that we discussed, or some states outlawing the death penalty, for example. So, um, in some cases, this reflects changes in our government structure and the positions of those who hold political office. Um, in some cases, we see more conservatives winning more elections. In other states, we see liberals winning more elections, and when that happens, we see a change in the type of laws that are being passed. For example, some states are passing stricter gun laws, while others are passing looser gun laws. All right, and we'll see this with things again: marijuana, gun laws, abortion, the death penalty. Okay, um, so here on the right we have public perceptions of crime rate versus the reality. So here is the percentage of individuals in the U.S. That think that you know there is more crime in the U.S. than there was a year ago versus violent crime over time. It's actually been decreasing, but for some reason, right, some individuals thought it was increasing. So part of it could be the media, okay, part of the perception or the rhetoric of some individuals in office. So this will go hand in hand when you guys take crime in the media. Those of you that are majoring in criminal justice. Um, so perception can definitely influence criminal justice policy, right? Um, we might see the case that, as I said earlier, that some tough on crime policies might be passed, even though it might not necessarily be necessary because crime rates are actually dropping. But again, if you're a politician, you have to please your constituents. You have to give them what they want if you want to be reelected. Um, Something else, for example, is that going back to the example of marijuana, we see this headline here: thousands of weed convictions will be automatically expunged in Cook County. We are righting the wrongs of the past. That is a quote. So in this particular case, individuals at one point in time thought that, hey, you know, the consumption of marijuana, one, should be illegal, and two, you know, individuals should get in trouble for it. Now that we see that individuals are taking the stance that, well, if we're going to legalize marijuana, then maybe people shouldn't be punished for it either. So with people's perceptions, now the lawmakers have to go and, like it says here, remove those marijuana convictions or have them expunged in Cook County. Okay. So now we're going to go into a research within policies. So what's important here is determining how do we know what works, right? So policymakers do not always know, you know, what the cutting edge research says about the types of programs and strategies that are effective in reducing crime rates. So there are certainly examples of policies that were created or changed using research, and these cases are often the exception rather than the rule, according to Maleko. But this will leave scholars often looking at whether a policy is effective after it's been implemented, and this is kind of the case that we saw here with the study I showed you on the body-worn cameras. So there's going to be many federal agencies. Actually, let me roll back a bit. So research has been incentivized with like the passing of the Crime Control Act of 1973. So within this legislation, the government established what's called the National Institute of Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice, and this served as what's called the clearinghouse for criminal justice information. So because of that act, today we have many federal agencies, right, that are going to fund, conduct, and disseminate research on criminal justice policy. So aside from federal agencies that are going to do this, we also have private institutions, non-governmental organizations that will conduct their own research and disseminate the findings as well. So here we have from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Office of Violence Against Women and Community-Oriented Police Services, COPS, which are, again, government programs that disseminate data and tell us about crime trends and if the policies that are being brought up are working. And then we have the private the private foundations like the Gun Violence Project and the Sentencing Project that will also do research to see if certain programs, certain policies, laws, or regulations are working. Now, something that is important with these policies that are passed is consistency. Consistency in that if a program that we apply in one area, if we were to apply it in another area, will it be consistent? Will it generate the same positive results? And this is what we call program fidelity. So program fidelity is going to involve 7 different factors, and that is how the program's delivered, the dosage of the program, what's the setting, the target population, what are the materials that are needed, the provider qualifications, and the training that's given to that provider for that specific policy to be to have positive consequences. So think of something that comes off the top of my head of vaping. Okay, let's say vaping. We want less kids to to be vaping in their teen years, for example. So what strategies are we going to use to deliver this material, right? Are we going to give lectures to students? Are we going to have discussions with them? Are they going to have active learning inside the classroom? Who's going to fund this? Is this going to be within the school curriculum? Is the state of Florida going to say, okay, every single county in Florida has to do this, and they have to devote class time to do this? Is there going to be, for example, all the students go to the auditorium one day of the month, and they have guest speakers, right? Maybe, like it says here with the dosage, maybe it'll be more than once a month. Maybe it'll be once a week. Maybe it'll be every day, right? So how frequent and how long are these sessions going to be? And then the setting, do we want it in a big setting? Do we want um, a big auditorium setting, or we want, again, this is for vaping, or do we want a small setting, for example, so that students could talk about this? Who are we trying to target? Is it only going to be males? Do we know that males are more at risk of abusing vape pens, for example? Or is it both males and females? We're probably going to want to target middle and high school students. Okay, we already know that they do DARE with fifth graders. Do we want to look for specific characteristics of risk factors? Do we want to dedicate more time to more at-risk populations or schools in certain areas that might be more at risk? What materials will we need? Are we going to have any audiovisual modules, right? Are we going to have like a PowerPoint, a Prezi, a video that's going to be included in this anti-vaping awareness program? Who's giving these presentations? What's the qualification of the provider? Is it going to be a doctor? Is it going to be another type of healthcare professional? Is it going to be, for example, someone like a DARE officer? And then what's the training that we're going to have for the individuals that are providing the program to the target population? So these are the fidelity factors that we have to keep in mind to make sure that consistency is carried out everywhere that the program is implemented. So now we're at the light of the end of the tunnel and at the conclusion. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind that both elected officials and citizens are going to be the ones that are going to bring problems to light, and they're the ones that are going to make demands for safer communities and increased punishment for offenders. They're the ones that are going to discuss about the criminal justice policies, and they're going to always have different mindsets, and their arguments are going to vary, and it's going to invoke a lot of emotions across different types of groups. Okay, just think of some of the topics I've discussed now, right? You might have, for example, the victim of a gun crime versus someone who is a very strong supporter of the Second Amendment. That's going to definitely invoke a lot of emotion and possibly a heated debate. So these policies are always going to rely on political influence to either pass or implement these policies. And this is why a lot of these non-governmental organizations or private groups or might lobby politicians to support their views. Sometimes these policies are going to be put into place so they can keep our community safer, but is that always the case? Remember, sometimes people's perceptions think that crime is worse and they want a tough on crime approach. And politicians might just pass that specific policy to keep their constituency happy, to keep their voters happy, even though it wasn't necessary, for example. And this goes hand in hand with this asterisk here, that politicians aim to reflect the values of their constituency, whether or not the perceptions or the opinions of that constituency is data driven or not. Or maybe it's just sometimes they're looking at certain media outlets that might misrepresent misrepresent the actual evidence or the actual facts. So going back to this, the media can often inflame threats of criminal activity and victimization, and this is why sometimes we're leading to the retention of outdated policies that might not be necessary anymore. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the presentation for criminal justice policy. If you have any questions, any comments, concerns, as always, feel free to reach out to me.